Science has declared 9 species extinct in the Appalachian Mountains, one of them for over 11,000 years. Somebody forgot to tell the animals. Picture the oldest mountain range in North America, older than the Rockies. Older, some geologists argue, than complex life on land itself. Ridges folded and worn smooth over 500 million years, buried today under some of the densest, least surveyed forest east of the Mississippi. Hollows that satellites can map, but that no biologist has ever walked into. We've treated extinction like a closed case file. A date gets stamped on a species, a museum drawer gets a new label, and the story ends. But in the Appalachians, that story keeps reopening, decade after decade, in the mouths of hunters, hikers, and field biologists who never set out looking for a ghost in the first place. Here's the part most people never stop to consider. An official declaration of extinction isn't a photograph of the last animal dying. It's a bureaucratic judgment call, made after enough years pass without confirmed evidence. So, therefore, the line between extinct and just very good at hiding depends entirely on how thoroughly a place has actually been searched. And almost nowhere in the eastern United States has been searched less thoroughly than these mountains. By the time we reach the #1 spot, you'll have seen the evidence, the testimony, and the actual science that makes these mountains a near-perfect hiding place for ghost species, starting with a bird declared gone in 1918 and ending with a predator that should have died out with the glaciers themselves, 11,000 years before anyone alive today was born. Let's start with the smallest ghost on the list. Picture a birdwatcher in a cove forest of the southern Appalachians, early morning, fog still sitting low between the ridgelines. A flash of green and yellow cuts across the tree line and disappears. She checks her field guide. Nothing native matches the color pattern. Nothing native is supposed to, posed. The Carolina parakeet was small, about the size of a mourning dove, but built like a jewel. Emerald body, a golden yellow head, a face washed in orange. In flocks, thousands strong, they could darken a patch of sky the way a passing cloud does, a wash of moving color over the treetops. The species was declared extinct in 1918, when the last known individual, a bird named Incas, died in captivity at the Cincinnati Zoo, in the very same cage, coincidentally, that had held Martha the passenger pigeon 4 years earlier. Hunters had shot them for the feather trade, since their bright plumage was prized for women's hats. Farmers killed them by the thousand to protect fruit crops. Their old-growth forest habitat kept shrinking behind them, tree by tree. So the wild population collapsed decades before Incas ever did, and by the time anyone thought to protect the species, there was barely anything left to protect. Here's where it gets strange. Long after 1918, reports kept surfacing. Green and yellow birds seen at forest edges in the Smokies and the Carolinas, sometimes in pairs, sometimes solo, sporadically for years afterward. Skeptics point to escaped pet parakeets, or feral monk parakeets that have established themselves elsewhere in the country, and they're not wrong to. There's still no photograph, no specimen, no DNA. But nobody has ever fully mapped those remote coves either, and a bird only truly disappears the moment the last witness stops looking up. If a creature this small can slip through the cracks of an entire century, imagine what a full-grown elk can do in a valley nobody enters. A hunter in the backcountry of West Virginia, deep in the Monongahela Highlands, hears a bugle call at first light. Long, rising, unmistakable. He knows what elk sound like. He also knows there aren't supposed to be any elk here. The eastern elk was a heavyweight. Bulls could weigh over 400 kilograms, roughly the mass of a small car, with antler racks spreading wider than a doorway. They moved in herds through valley floors that are now farmland and highway. The subspecies was extirpated by 1877, driven out by unregulated market hunting and the settlement of river valleys that pushed herds into smaller and smaller pockets until there was nowhere left to retreat to. Farmers cleared bottomland for crops. Hunters sold hides and antlers by the wagon load, and there were no bag limits, no seasons, nothing to slow the decline. So a species that once numbered in the millions across the eastern half of the continent was gone within a couple of generations. A blink, geologically speaking. Here's the twist. Wildlife agencies did reintroduce western elk into parts of Kentucky and Virginia starting in 2001. But bugling calls and fresh sign, wallows, antler rubs, tracks, keep turning up in hollows far outside those stocking zones in West Virginia counties with no official herd at all. Biologists mostly explain this as wandering bulls dispersing from the reintroduced herds, animals that can travel far further than people expect. Still, genetic studies suggest fragments of the old eastern lineage may survive folded inside the reintroduced western stock, which means the eastern elk isn't purely extinct so much as diluted, gone as a bloodline, but still walking these ridges in disguise. A lone animal vanishing is one kind of mystery. A species vanishing because there were simply too many of them is another kind entirely. 19th century witnesses across Kentucky and the Appalachian foothills described flocks so massive they blotted out the sun for hours at a time, a living storm cloud that took days to pass overhead completely. The bird itself wasn't large, about the size of a mourning dove, with a longer, more elegant tail. What made it staggering was scale. A single flock, naturalists estimated, could stretch farther than most people's daily commute, wingtip to wingtip, for mile after mile. The species went extinct in 1914, when Martha, the last known passenger pigeon, died at the Cincinnati Zoo, a bird so famous her body was packed in ice and shipped to the Smithsonian. Commercial hunters, coordinated by telegraph to track the flocks in real time, netted and shot them by the millions, loading entire boxcars for city markets. At the same time, loggers were clearing the mast-producing hardwood forests the birds depended on for food, the acorns and beech nuts that fueled those massive migrations. So a population once numbering in the billions, likely the most abundant bird species on the planet, collapsed inside 50 years. Here's where it gets strange. For decades afterward, isolated reports described dense, fast-moving pigeon flocks over remote Appalachian ridgelines, some witnesses insisting a pocket of the species had simply escaped the slaughter by retreating deep into the mountains. Ornithologists are skeptical, pointing to band-tailed pigeons, mourning doves, or introduced starlings as far more likely culprits. And biologically, the passenger pigeon may have needed enormous flock sizes just to breed and survive, meaning a handful of stragglers probably couldn't have made it on their own. But the sightings never fully went away, and they still populate the folklore of these mountains. From a bird of the open sky, we move to a beast built for the valley floor. An elderly resident in the Virginia highlands recalls her grandfather's stories of a hollow where wild cattle once wallowed in the mud, long after they were supposed to be gone. A hiker later finds the exact depression he described, still faintly visible in the soil. The eastern woodland bison was built like a pickup truck, over 900 kilograms, with a smaller hump and thicker coat than its plains cousin, adapted for forest rather than open prairie. The subspecies vanished from the Appalachians sometime in the mid-1700s to early 1800s, hunted out and pushed westward as colonial settlement pressed into the mountains. Salt licks that once drew herds by the hundred were staked out by hunters instead. Herds fragmented into smaller and smaller groups, cut off from each other by farmland and fences, until the eastern population disappeared from the historical record entirely, more than a century before the more famous slaughter of the plains, bison even began. Here's the twist. Bones and skulls still surface in caves and sinkholes across the region, and oral histories from isolated communities describe small herds persisting in certain hollows well past the official extirpation dates. Historians caution that some of these stories may describe feral domestic cattle, memory blurred across generations. But the physical bone evidence does show that Appalachian bison held on in isolated terrain later than lowland populations elsewhere. Proof that rugged, hard-to-reach ground really can buy a species extra time, folklore or not. From something hunted for meat and hide, we move to something hunted purely out of fear. Campers in the Great Smoky Mountains record a howl in the middle of the night, long, low, sustained in a way that doesn't match anything in the park's coyote recordings. Park biologists, intrigued, start reviewing the audio themselves. The eastern wolf sat between a coyote and a gray wolf in size, roughly the bulk of a large German shepherd, but leaner, longer-legged, built for chasing prey through dense timber rather than open plains. The subspecies was effectively wiped out through bounty programs and organized persecution, across the 19th and early 20th centuries, with counties paying cash for every wolf pelt turned in, and the last confirmed individuals removed from the wild by the early 1900s. So the apex predator role in these forests fell largely to coyotes, which later expanded east and interbred with wolves and domestic dogs into the hybrid now nicknamed the coy wolf, an animal that didn't exist before the original predator's absence left a gap for it to fill. Here's where it gets strange. Bioacoustic recordings from the Smokies have picked up howls with a lower pitch and longer sustain than typical coyote vocalizations, prompting a genuine round of scientific reinvestigation. Most biologists argue these are large coy wolf hybrids, not pure eastern wolves. But genetic testing on some canids trapped in the region has turned up real eastern wolf ancestry, surviving inside those hybrid populations, meaning the eastern wolf isn't purely gone. It got absorbed into something else that still hunts these ridges at night. If one predator can vanish by blending into another species entirely, here's one that refuses to be declared dead at all. In the old-growth remnants tucked into the southern Appalachian foothills, a birder photographs a large woodpecker at a distance, gets 3 blurry frames, and spends the rest of the year arguing with ornithologists online about what they actually show. The ivory-billed woodpecker was the largest of its kind north of Mexico, nearly crow-sized, with a wingspan wider than an open umbrella, a startling ivory-colored bill, and bold, white wing markings visible even in flight. The species was declared extinct, primarily due to the logging of the old-growth bottomland forest it depended on, specifically the large, standing dead trees and the beetle grubs living inside their rotting wood. Once that habitat was cut for timber, the bird had nowhere left that could sustain it. The last universally accepted sighting dates to 1944, though the bird wasn't formally proposed for delisting from the endangered species list until decades later, a bureaucratic hesitation that speaks for itself. Here's the twist. Disputed video and audio recordings, the bird's distinctive nasal kent calls, along with a double-knock pattern on tree trunks, keep surfacing from remote old-growth pockets near the Appalachian foothills, reigniting hope among a small but persistent group of ornithologists. Critics say the footage is too blurred to confirm, and that the calls could easily belong to blue jays mimicking the sound, or to the much more common pileated woodpecker. No specimen, egg, or clear photo has surfaced in over 80 years, but the volume and consistency of independent reports across decades has kept federal wildlife officials from issuing a final, definitive no, which makes this officially an open case. From a bird nobody can prove is dead, we move to a big cat the government officially, dramatically declared extinct. A family checks their trail camera in the Virginia mountains and finds a large, tawny cat crossing a logging road at dusk, tail trailing long behind it. They send the photo to the state wildlife agency. It's not the first one the agency has received that year. A cougar's body is roughly the length of a couch, with males weighing up to 70 kilograms and a tail as long and thick as a broomstick, built entirely for stalking and ambushing deer in dense cover. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service formally declared the eastern cougar extinct in 2018, following a review process that began in 2011 and involved combing through decades of sighting reports before reaching a conclusion, decades after the last confirmed breeding population had already disappeared. Hunted heavily as a threat to livestock, with bounties in some states well into the 20th century, its range east of the Mississippi collapsed to nothing, aside from the endangered Florida panther and occasional wandering males dispersing in from western populations. Here's where it gets strange. State wildlife agencies across the Appalachians have logged thousands of cougar sighting reports over the decades, and some are corroborated. Tracks, scat-carrying confirmed cougar DNA, clear trail camera photos. Agencies themselves acknowledge that at least some of these are real, wandering males traveling thousands of kilometers from western states. Officials maintain these are dispersing individuals, not proof of a surviving breeding eastern population, so the extinction ruling stands on paper. But newer genetic research has actually challenged whether eastern and western cougars were ever truly distinct subspecies to begin with, rather than simply one continuous population that got fragmented by human pressure, meaning the line between extinct and simply passing through might be more about paperwork than biology. A species can be declared gone from a place while its individual members keep quietly proving otherwise, one trail camera at a time. We've gone from a confirmed modern predator to something 4 times its size and dead for 11,000 years. A caver working a limestone system in the West Virginia mountains finds massive fossilized bones wedged in a side passage, far too large for any black bear. Elsewhere, hunters in the Smokies describe something else entirely. A bear-shaped animal, standing upright, unusually tall and thin-limbed, moving with long bipedal strides that don't match a black bear's shuffling gait. Arctodus simus was the largest terrestrial predator of Ice Age North America. Standing on its hind legs, it reached heights comparable to a basketball hoop, over 3.4 meters, taller than a standard doorframe by a full head and shoulders. It could weigh up to 900 kilograms, with proportionally longer legs than any living bear, built for covering ground fast rather than the stocky, digging build of a modern grizzly or black bear. The species went extinct roughly 11,000 years ago, at the close of the Pleistocene, likely tied to the collapse of its Ice Age prey base. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, ancient horses, as glaciers retreated and the climate shifted rapidly. Without enough large prey to sustain an animal that size, therefore, the short-faced bear had no path forward. So its ecological niche closed along with the Ice Age itself, leaving only scattered bones in caves, as the only remaining trace of an animal that once ruled this entire continent unchallenged. Here's the twist. Reports across the Appalachian backcountry keep describing black bear-like animals that are unusually tall, oddly thin-limbed, and moving upright for long stretches. A silhouette that a small group of amateur researchers link directly back to the short-faced bear's body plan. Mainstream biologists point out that black bears frequently rear up and walk briefly on their hind legs, and that disease, injury, or mange can distort an animal's proportions and gait in ways that look genuinely strange from a distance, especially in low light or at a run. Still, no bone, hair, or track evidence younger than the end of the Pleistocene has ever surfaced anywhere on the continent, which is exactly the kind of gap a real relict population shouldn't be able to hide behind for 11,000 years. The case leans hard toward folklore, and yet, somehow, sighting after sighting, it refuses to fully die. If a monster from the Ice Age can survive for 11,000 years in memory alone, what happens when that memory has had an entire culture and centuries longer to grow around it? Long before European settlers arrived, Cherokee oral tradition already carried stories of a great cat spirit prowling these ridgelines at night, powerful enough to be feared, elusive enough to never be caught. Centuries later, a trail camera in the Smokies catches a large, dark feline shape crossing a creek bed at 2 a.m., and the debate starts all over again. Is this the oldest legend in Appalachia or the newest one? Witnesses across 2 centuries describe roughly the same animal, a large black cat, bigger and heavier than any bobcat, closer in build to a jaguar or a black panther of storybook legend, with a long tail and eyes that catch the light like a coin. Officially, this animal has never existed at all. Melanistic, solid black. Cougars have never once been confirmed anywhere in North America in the entire scientific record, despite black jaguars and black leopards being well documented elsewhere in the world. So unlike every other name on this list, the Wampus cat was never declared extinct, because it was never declared anything. It simply never earned a place in the taxonomy to begin with, folded into legend from the very start, treated as story before it was ever treated as a specimen. Here's where it gets strange. Recent decades have brought a growing, consistent volume of eyewitness reports across multiple Appalachian states, along with trail camera captures of large, dark felines that some researchers argue can't all be dismissed as house cats or lighting tricks, especially as unusually dark-coated cougars have rarely turned up confirmed elsewhere in the Americas. Skeptics point to black dogs, escaped exotic pets, oversized feral cats, and the deceptive tricks low forest light plays on the eye. And they're right that no physical specimen has ever been produced. But the sheer consistency of the description across 200 years, unconnected witnesses, oral tradition, and now data-backed sighting clusters, is exactly the pattern that turned every other animal on this list from myth into biology. once somebody finally looked hard enough. So maybe the science was never wrong about any of these 9 species. Maybe extinct was never really a fact about the animal at all, just a measurement of how much of these mountains we've actually managed to see. The Appalachians are old, vast, and still, in places, genuinely unwatched. Mountains that predate the animals that walk them, and that will likely outlast every date stamped on every extinction record. From a parakeet gone in 1918 to a predator that should have died with the glaciers, every case on this list points to the same uncomfortable gap, the distance between what we've confirmed and what's actually still out there, moving through hollows no camera has ever reached. So the next time you're deep in these hills, and the forest goes quiet in a way that doesn't feel natural, ask yourself the question this whole video has been building toward. What if extinction was never the end of the story? Just the point where we stopped looking? If you want to know which other landscapes on Earth might be hiding their own ghosts, that's exactly where we're headed next. So stay close, and don't go anywhere just